They read my father's will without calling my name once. 6 months later, I stood on a stage in front of 300 people and called hers. But to understand how I got there, you need to understand what I lost first. Not just my father, but the version of my life where I still believed his wife loved him. Before we go any further, if stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe now because you do not want to miss how far she went to get the truth out. Stay till the end. This one earns it. I'm Emily Carter, and for 34 years, I thought I knew what family meant. Then my father died on a Tuesday in March, and by Thursday, his wife had already changed the locks on his study. My father, Robert Carter, built his real estate firm from a single rented office in 1994. By the time I was in college, Carter & Associates had grown into one of the most respected development firms on the East Coast. He was proud but never arrogant. He used to say, "A name only means something if you protect it." I didn't know yet how hard I'd have to fight to protect mine. He married Vanessa when I was 26. She was warm at first, attentive, funny, quick with a compliment. I wanted to believe she loved him for who he was, not what he had. My mother had passed years earlier, and I told myself my father deserved happiness. I ignored the small things. The way she corrected him in front of guests. The way she called his company our company, long before it legally was. For years, life felt almost normal. Holidays at the house, Sunday dinners, Vanessa hosting elegant little gatherings that made my father laugh in a way I hadn't seen since my mother passed. I told myself the odd comments were nothing, that every marriage has friction. I wanted my father happy more than I wanted to be right about my doubts, so I swallowed them, again and again. Without realizing how much I was swallowing, the first real crack came 18 months before my father died, when he was diagnosed with a heart condition that slowly, quietly began limiting his life. Vanessa took over managing his schedule, including who could visit and when. I noticed I was seeing him less. Phone calls got shorter. She always had a reason. He was resting, he was tired, the doctor wanted quiet. I believed her because questioning her felt like questioning his care. One evening, I drove over unannounced and found my father alone in his study, visibly relieved to see me, asking why I hadn't come by more. I told him Vanessa said he needed rest. He looked at me strangely and said, "I've been resting alone for weeks, Em." That sentence sat in my chest the whole drive home. I didn't understand yet what it meant. I just knew something about it felt wrong. 3 months before he passed, my father was hospitalized briefly for a cardiac scare. I rushed to the hospital and found Vanessa already there, composed, handling the doctors, answering questions on his behalf before he could speak for himself. When I tried to ask him privately how he was really feeling, she stayed in the room the entire time. I remember thinking, for the first time clearly, that she wasn't protecting him. She was controlling the narrative around him. He came home from the hospital weaker, quieter. I visited more often after that, pushing past Vanessa's scheduling excuses. In one of our last real conversations, sitting in his study, he told me, unprompted, "Everything stays the way it's always been, Em. The company goes to you and your brother. I haven't changed a thing." I held onto those words tightly in the months that followed, not yet knowing how directly they would be contradicted. My father passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, with Vanessa by his side and me 20 minutes away, stuck in traffic I would regret for the rest of my life. The funeral was quiet, dignified, exactly how he would have wanted it. Vanessa wore black and diamond earrings I'd never seen before. My father wasn't a jewelry man. He gave practical gifts, watches, pens, photographs. Diamonds weren't his language. I filed the thought away and blamed grief for my suspicion. 3 days after the funeral, my brother Daniel called me, his voice tight. "Emily, she changed the locks on Dad's study." I laughed at first, assuming he misunderstood. He hadn't. When I drove to the house, my key no longer worked on the side door. Vanessa opened it herself, arms crossed, telling me it was just easier this way while things get sorted out. Sorted out by whom? I wanted to ask. I didn't yet know how much had already been decided without me. The will reading was scheduled 2 weeks later at Hale & Whitman, my father's longtime law firm. I sat beside Daniel, expecting confirmation of what my father always told me. The company would eventually be mine to run, with Daniel as a partner once he finished school. Vanessa sat across from us, composed, hands folded, an unreadable smile I mistook foolishly for grief. Richard Hale, the family attorney, cleared his throat and began reading. My father's original wishes were there: the house to Vanessa, a trust for Daniel's education, and controlling interest in Carter and Associates to me. Then Richard paused and produced a second document. An amendment, he said, executed 4 months before Robert's passing. My stomach dropped before he even finished the sentence. The amendment transferred majority ownership of the company to Vanessa. My inheritance was reduced to a modest cash sum. Enough to be insulting, not enough to matter. I asked to see my father's signature. Richard slid the document toward me without meeting my eyes. It looked like his signature, almost exactly like his, but my father hadn't left his own bed without my help in his final months. He couldn't have walked into an office to sign anything. He must have done it at home, Vanessa said smoothly, before I'd even finished the question. Richard came by personally. Richard nodded, adjusting his tie, avoiding my eyes for a second too long. It was such a small gesture. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But I'd spent my career reading blueprints, noticing when something didn't line up. That gesture didn't line up. Vanessa spoke again, her voice gentler now, almost pitying. Emily, I know this is hard to hear, but your father finally saw who you really were toward the end, how little time you actually made for him. The words landed like a slap. I thought of every visit she'd rescheduled, every phone call she'd shortened, and I understood in that moment that she wasn't just taking his money. She was rewriting his memory of me. I didn't argue in that room. I've learned that outrage in the wrong moment only hands your enemy the story they want to tell. The bitter daughter, unable to accept her father's choices. So I thanked Richard for his time, hugged Daniel goodbye, and walked out of that office with a calm expression and a mind already working. If Vanessa thought grief had made me weak, she was about to learn how wrong she was. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with every email my father had ever sent me, searching for any mention of an amendment, any hint he'd planned to change the will. Nothing. Not one word. My father discussed everything with me, every renovation, every hire, every decision, big or small. A change of this magnitude and he said nothing? It wasn't just suspicious. Given what he'd told me in his study weeks before he died, it was impossible. I called my father's longtime assistant, Marjorie, who had worked at Carter and Associates for 18 years. She hesitated before speaking, her voice lowering like she was checking over her shoulder. Emily, in his last few months, your father barely left the house. If he signed anything at the office, I would have scheduled it. I didn't schedule anything with Richard in that window. My hands went cold. I asked Marjorie if she still had the office visitor logs from those months. She said she could pull them, carefully, without drawing attention. 2 days later, an email arrived from her personal account, not her work one. Attached was a scanned visitor log. Richard Hale's name appeared exactly twice in the final 4 months of my father's life. Both visits logged as Personal V. Carter, not Robert. It wasn't proof of forgery. Not yet. But it was proof that the story Vanessa and Richard told in that room, he signed it at the office, was a lie. And if that detail was fabricated, what else was? I started a private folder on my laptop labeled simply Dad. Inside it, I began collecting everything: emails, photos, visitor logs, anything that might one day matter. A week later, my phone rang late at night, an unfamiliar number. It was Tom Reyes, a longtime project manager at Carter and Associates, who'd known me since I was a teenager visiting my father's office after school. His voice was careful, almost apologetic. Emily, I probably shouldn't be calling you about this, but something's been bothering me for weeks. There's a new vendor on our books I've never heard of. And the payments are strange. Tom explained that finance had processed several large payments to a company called VC Strategic Consulting over recent months, labeled as advisory fees, but no one in operations could identify what services had actually been provided. He'd asked a question in a meeting and been told, a little too firmly, to let finance handle it. Something about the dismissiveness had stuck with him. He trusted me enough to mention it, quietly, off the record. I thanked Tom and told him, gently, to be careful. Not to ask further questions himself, not yet. If Vanessa realized people were noticing, she'd have time to cover her tracks. I added the name VC Strategic Consulting to my folder, next to the visitor logs, next to the timeline of my father's final months. Pieces were starting to form a shape I didn't like. A few days later, Daniel showed up at my apartment unannounced, looking pale. I found something, he said, and I don't know what to do with it. He handed me his phone. open to a text thread he'd stumbled across while borrowing his mother's laptop for a school project. A shared cloud account neither of them had thought to fully separate. The messages weren't from a business contact. They were from Richard. The messages spanned over a year. Some were affectionate in a way no attorney writes to a client's wife. Others discussed logistics, hotel names, timing, warnings to delete after reading. Daniel's hands were shaking as he scrolled. "Emily, is this what I think it is?" I didn't answer right away. I was too busy screenshotting every page, my heart pounding, understanding for the first time just how deep this went. I told Daniel to say nothing to his mother, not yet. If Vanessa realized we knew, she would have time to cover her tracks, delete accounts, coach her story, maybe even push Richard to destroy documents. "We're not going to fight her with feelings," I told him. "We're going to fight her with facts. But we need more than texts, and we need to be smarter than she thinks we are." The following week, my father's older sister, Aunt Carol, showed up at my door unannounced. Carrying a box of old family photos she said she'd been meaning to give me. Over coffee, almost offhandedly, she mentioned something that stopped me cold. "You know Vanessa had money troubles before she met your father, don't you? A failed business, some kind of investor lawsuit. Robert never liked talking about it, so I never brought it up again." I asked Aunt Carol if she remembered any details, names, dates, anything searchable. She didn't remember much, only that it involved a boutique. Event planning company Vanessa had run in her early 30s that collapsed under what Carol vaguely recalled as money that went missing. It wasn't evidence of anything happening now, but it reframed everything. This wasn't Vanessa's first time being accused of making money disappear. It just might have been her first time getting caught. Over the following weeks, I built quiet contact with a forensic document examiner named Priya Anand, a woman my father had once hired to authenticate a disputed contract years earlier. I sent her copies of my father's known signatures, dozens gathered from old letters, cards, contracts, alongside a photograph of the disputed will amendment Marjorie had discreetly obtained from the firm's archive. Priya's initial read, given carefully and without promises, was that the pressure and stroke pattern of the signature showed inconsistencies typical of tracing rather than natural signing, especially odd stiffness at the base of the R in Robert, a letter my father, a former engineer, always formed with a distinctive looping flourish. It wasn't a courtroom conclusion yet, but it was enough to keep going. I reached out to a friend from architecture school, now working in forensic accounting, and asked her to review anything publicly available or legally accessible to me as a beneficiary of my father's estate. What she found within days stunned me. A series of transfers from Carter & Associates' operating account into a shell. Consulting company registered just 3 months before my father's amendment was supposedly signed. The shell company, VC Strategic Consulting, had one listed officer, Vanessa Carter. Payments totaling nearly $200,000 had moved into that account over 4 months, money labeled internally as advisory fees for services no one at the firm, including Tom, could identify or recall receiving. It wasn't just an affair and a forged signature anymore. It was theft, methodically hidden behind paperwork. Vanessa, meanwhile, was moving fast. Within 2 months of the will reading, she'd begun quietly meeting with board members at Carter & Associates, positioning herself as the company's new face. She wore my father's watch to one meeting, the one he'd promised Daniel, and told a room of longtime employees that big changes were coming to modernize the brand. Longtime staff started calling me, worried, unsure who was really in charge. The first true public humiliation came at what would have been my father's 60th birthday, 3 months after his death. A memorial gathering Vanessa organized at the house, framed as a tribute. In front of nearly 50 guests, she stood and gave a long speech about carrying his vision forward alone, pointedly never mentioning me or Daniel by name, as though we were footnotes in a story she was already rewriting for the room. I sat through that speech with my hands folded in my lap, feeling every eye that flicked toward me afterward, waiting to see if I'd react. I didn't. I smiled, thanked people for coming, and left early, Daniel walking me to my car in silence. "How do you sit there and just take it?" he asked, frustration cracking his voice. "I'm not taking it," I told him quietly. "I'm building something she can't talk her way out of." I brought everything to an estate litigation attorney, Grace Whitfield, someone entirely outside my father's old firm and untouched by Richard's influence. She reviewed the signature analysis, the visitor logs, the shell company payments, and the messages Daniel had found. She was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "Emily, this isn't just a will dispute. This is fraud and possibly embezzlement. We can build a real case." Grace explained our options. We could file quietly in probate court, a private, often slow process that could take over a year and might end in a settlement rather than public accountability. Or, once our evidence was airtight, we could choose the moment and place we revealed it ourselves, publicly, before Vanessa had a chance to spin the narrative first. I already knew which option my father would have respected more: direct, transparent, undeniable. "There's something coming up," I told Grace. "The company's 50th anniversary gala. Live-streamed, board members, investors, press, everyone who matters to the business my father built." Grace considered it carefully. Legally, we could file the probate contest first, privately, so everything I presented publicly was already part of an active court record, protecting me from any claim of defamation. It would take precision. It would take time. I had both. Over the following weeks, Grace filed our formal petition contesting the will amendment in probate court, quietly, without press. The filing itself became public record, meaning anything drawn directly from it could be referenced openly, without risk. Vanessa's legal team was notified through standard channels. She had no idea yet how much evidence sat behind that single filing, or that I intended to let the world see it on her terms, in front of a camera. Daniel became something I hadn't expected. An ally, not a bystander caught in the middle. He started keeping a careful log of things he overheard at home. Phone calls Vanessa took in the garage, a new safe installed in what used to be Dad's study, an increasingly tense relationship between Vanessa and Richard as the pressure of hiding money and an affair began to wear on both of them. One night, Daniel called me in a hushed voice. "She's panicking," he said. I heard her yelling at Richard on the phone about the accounts and people asking questions. Someone at the firm, likely Tom, cautiously following up through proper channels during a routine audit prep meeting, had asked Vanessa a direct question about the consulting payments. The walls slowly were closing in on her, exactly the way careful evidence should close them. A near miss came 2 weeks later. Vanessa showed up unannounced at my apartment, her tone sweet but her eyes searching. "I just want us to be a family again, Emily. Whatever's going on with the lawyers, we don't need to make it ugly." I kept my folder closed on the counter behind me, my expression pleasant, giving her nothing. "I agree," I said. "No need to make it ugly at all." She left unsatisfied. Unable to read whether I knew anything, that same week, Richard reached out to Grace's office directly, requesting an informal conversation to resolve this among family, without unnecessary escalation. Grace declined on my behalf, in writing, citing the active filing. It was a small moment, but a telling one. Richard was scared enough to try negotiating before we'd shown a single piece of evidence publicly. Fear, I was learning, moves faster than guilt ever does. Grace and I met with Priya Anand one final time. Her formal written report was unambiguous. The signature on the will amendment showed clear indicators of forgery through tracing, supported by pen pressure analysis unavailable to the naked eye, combined with the visitor logs, the financial trail, and the private messages. We now had what Grace called a complete narrative, not circumstantial fragments, but a documented, provable sequence of deception. There was a moment, late one night, staring at everything spread across my kitchen table, where the weight of it all finally caught up to me. I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for the truth of who my father was in his final months. Not a man who'd rejected his daughter, but a man who'd been quietly isolated by someone he trusted. I cried for the first time in months, not from anger, but from missing him, plainly and completely. The anniversary gala was scheduled for the second Saturday of September, held in the Carter & Associates headquarters atrium, live-streamed to employees, investors, and press across the country. Vanessa had positioned herself as the evening's host, a public unveiling of herself as the company's new leadership figure. She had no idea the stage she built for her own coronation would become the exact place her story ended. In the days leading up to the gala, I met with the company's board privately, not to accuse Vanessa yet, but to inform them, under legal counsel, that pending litigation existed regarding the estate and company ownership, and that I would be addressing it publicly at the event to ensure full transparency for investors. The board, alarmed but grateful for the warning, agreed to give me floor time during the evening's program. One board member, quietly, admitted she'd had her own doubts about Vanessa's sudden authority over company decisions, but hadn't known how to raise them without proof. Hearing that only confirmed what I already suspected. People had noticed. They just hadn't had anything solid enough to act on. I was about to hand them exactly that. The night before the gala, Daniel texted me one final piece of information. Vanessa had scheduled a private toast early in the program, thanking the board for their trust in this new chapter. She planned to announce herself as permanent CEO that night, in front of cameras before any court date could interfere. She was racing the calendar. She just didn't know I'd already lapped her. I barely slept that night, running through every slide, every fact, every word I planned to say, making sure nothing I presented could be challenged as speculation. Grace had reminded me more than once that precision mattered more than emotion in a moment like this. "Let the documents do the shouting," she said. "You just have to hold the microphone steady." I intended to hold it very steady indeed. The gala night arrived. The atrium glowed gold under string lighting my father had personally chosen years earlier. 300 guests filled the room. Investors, longtime staff, family friends, and a press table live streaming the event to thousands more online. Vanessa stood near the stage in a deep emerald gown, greeting guests with practiced warmth, utterly unaware of the folder sitting quietly in my bag. Richard arrived separately, seated near the back with other legal representatives of the firm, careful to maintain distance from Vanessa in public, a habit of two people used to hiding, but too confident it had worked. I watched them exchange one brief glance across the room, a small private smile between them. It was the same expression I'd once mistaken at my father's funeral for grief. Daniel found me near the entrance, his suit slightly too formal for someone still so young, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. "As ready as I'll ever be," I told him, squeezing his hand once. He'd been carrying more than any 19-year-old should have to carry these past months, torn between loyalty to a mother he loved and a truth he couldn't unsee. Tonight, that weight would finally lift, one way or another. The program began. A company historian spoke about my father's early years, the single rented office, the first modest development, the values he'd built the firm on. I felt my throat tighten not with sadness this time, but with resolve. Everything I was about to do was for that man, for the name he'd protected his entire life, and for the truth he deserved even after death. Vanessa took the stage exactly as Daniel predicted, a glass of champagne in hand, thanking the board for believing in a new era of leadership. She spoke warmly about honoring Robert's memory, her voice catching theatrically at just the right moment. The crowd applauded. She turned to hand the microphone back to the host, visibly pleased with herself, expecting the evening to move smoothly into her formal announcement. That's when the host, per the arrangement made with the board days earlier, announced a short unscheduled address on behalf of the Carter family and called my name. I saw Vanessa's smile falter for half a second before she caught herself, recovering into practiced grace. She likely assumed I intended a sentimental tribute to my father. She had no idea what was actually loaded on the screen behind me. I walked to the podium calmly, folder in hand, Grace seated in the front row with our formal probate filing ready as backup documentation should anyone question the legitimacy of what I was about to share. I looked out at the room. Employees who had known me since childhood, investors who trusted this company's name, and Vanessa, standing near the stage with a champagne glass slowly lowering in her hand. "Thank you for the warm words tonight about my father's legacy," I began, my voice steady. 50 years ago, he built this company on one principle above all others, that a name only means something if you protect it. Tonight, I'm here to protect it. I nodded to the technician at the side of the stage, and the first slide appeared on the screen behind me. It was the visitor log from Carter & Associates offices, the two entries under Richard Hale's name during the final months of my father's life, both marked personal V. Carter, not Robert. "My father's will was reportedly amended during a signing at this office," I said. "According to the firm's own records, he was never here to sign anything during that window." A murmur moved through the room. Next appeared Priya Anand's forensic signature analysis, displayed cleanly, professionally, without theatrics, just facts on a screen. "This is an independent, court-filed forensic examination of the signature on the amended will," I said. "It concludes clear indicators of forgery through tracing." I watched Vanessa's face shift from composed to something colder, harder, as she realized this wasn't a tribute. It was a reckoning, and it was already public. The third slide showed the shell company filing for VC Strategic Consulting. Alongside the financial transfers, nearly $200,000 moved from company accounts into it under the label advisory fees, with no corresponding services on record. This is public record, filed as part of an active probate contest, I said clearly, aware every word needed to be provably true. I want to be careful and fair tonight. Everything I'm showing you is documented, and everything is already part of a court filing. Vanessa moved toward the stage, her voice sharp over the murmuring crowd. Emily, this is not the place. I looked at her directly, calm, unshaken. You're right that grief isn't the place for this. But fraud affecting this company's investors, its employees, and its future absolutely is. The board chair, seated near the front, gave a small, deliberate nod, silently affirming that I'd been given the floor for exactly this purpose. The fourth slide displayed a simplified timeline, my father's hospitalization, the sudden narrowing of his visitor access, and the amendment's execution date, laid side by side. These dates aren't accusations, I said carefully. They're simply what the records show. I'll let everyone in this room draw their own conclusions about what they mean. The silence in the atrium had a weight to it now, heavier than any applause. The final slide appeared. I hesitated only a moment, not from doubt but from the weight of what came next. It was a single carefully selected message from the private thread Daniel had found cropped to remove anything unnecessarily personal, showing only enough to establish the relationship's timeline relative to the estate amendment. I'm not sharing this to humiliate anyone. I said quietly I'm sharing it because it explains motive and because it's already part of the court record. The room had gone, completely silent except for the low hum of camera. Equipment still live streaming every second to thousands watching online. Richard Hale had gone pale near the back of the room, two board members already turning to look at him directly. Vanessa stood frozen near the stage, the champagne glass finally set down on a nearby table, her carefully constructed composure cracking in real time. I loved my father, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. And more than the company, more than any inheritance, I wanted the truth about how he was treated in his final months to matter. Tonight isn't about revenge. It's about making sure the name on this building still means what he built it to mean. I stepped back from the podium as the board chair rose to address the room. The board chair, visibly shaken but composed, announced that in light of the evidence presented and the active litigation, Vanessa's role in any leadership capacity was suspended immediately, pending full investigation, and that the company's legal team would be reviewing the amended will alongside the probate court. Security, quietly stationed near the exits at the board's precaution, moved gently but firmly to accompany Vanessa from the stage area. Vanessa didn't scream or cry, not at first. She simply looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from her before. Not grief, not anger, but the particular fear of someone who has just realized every door has quietly closed while they weren't watching. "You planned this," she said, low enough only I could hear. No, I told her. "You planned this." I just made sure the truth got a chance to catch up. Richard tried to leave quietly through a side exit, but two board members intercepted him near the coat check, informing him calmly that the firm's outside counsel would need to speak with him immediately regarding the will filing and the firm's liability. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face gray, already understanding that his career, built over 20 careful years, had likely ended in the span of 8 minutes. Guests didn't rush for the exits, as I'd half expected. Instead, a strange, quiet stillness settled over the room, employees exchanging glances, a few older staff members who remembered my father's early years looking at me with something like pride. One of them, a woman who'd worked reception since before I was born, caught my eye across the atrium and simply nodded once, slow and certain, as though to say, he would be proud of this. Aunt Carol found me near the edge of the room shortly after, pulling me into a tight hug. "I should have told you about her past sooner," she said quietly. "I didn't think it mattered anymore." I told her it. Mattered more than she knew. It had been one more thread in a pattern none of us had wanted to see clearly while my father was still alive to be hurt by it. Tom Reyes approached me later that night, visibly relieved, admitting he'd been terrified for weeks that raising the vendor question would cost him his job. "I just didn't want to stay quiet about something that felt wrong," he said. I thanked him for trusting his instincts and told him plainly that his willingness to ask one uncomfortable question in a meeting had been the first loose thread that helped unravel everything else. Daniel stood beside me for most of the night, quieter than usual, watching his mother be escorted from the building he'd grown up visiting on weekends with his father. I asked if he was okay. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I know you didn't lie about anything tonight. That has to count for something." It did. It counted for everything. In the weeks that followed, the probate court formally invalidated the forged will amendment, restoring my father's original wishes: majority ownership of Carter & Associates to me, with Daniel's education trust fully protected. Vanessa retained the house per the original valid will, but faced separate civil litigation from the company regarding the misappropriated funds. Alongside a state investigation into the forged signature, Richard Hale was reported to the State Bar Association. Within 2 months, an ethics investigation was underway, and his firm quietly asked him to resign before it concluded. The affair, once his greatest secret, became the least of his professional problems. The forgery and his role in facilitating the fraudulent amendment carried far heavier consequences, including the very real possibility of criminal charges. Vanessa, for her part, tried to paint herself publicly as a grieving widow attacked by a bitter stepdaughter. She gave one interview to a local outlet, tearful and composed, describing the gala as an ambush. But the forensic report, the visitor logs, and the financial trail were already part of a public court record, verifiable by anyone, including the journalist who ran a quiet follow-up story too. Weeks later, confirming every document I'd shown, that night, a detective from the county Financial Crimes Unit reached out to Grace's office shortly after the gala, requesting copies of the forensic accounting report as part of a preliminary review into the shell company transfers. It wasn't a criminal case yet, Grace reminded me carefully. Only an inquiry, but it was one more door that had opened because the evidence had been solid enough to survive. Scrutiny from people whose entire job was finding holes in stories like Vanessa's. Daniel moved in with me for the remainder of his gap year before college, needing distance from the chaos at his mother's house. It wasn't easy for him, loving his mother while also grappling with what she'd done. I never asked him to choose sides against her completely. I only asked him to stay honest, the way our father always had. He did, and it mattered more than he'll probably ever know. There were hard nights during that stretch. Daniel sitting quietly at my kitchen table long after dinner, working through feelings he didn't always have words for yet. One night he finally said, "I keep thinking about how much of my childhood was real and how much of it was just her managing things." I told him the love in that house had likely been real, even if the choices she made later weren't. He needed to hear that more than I realized. Vanessa reached out to me once, weeks after the gala, a short, careful email asking if we could talk, just the two of us, without lawyers. I considered it for a long moment before responding simply, "Anything you'd like to say, you're welcome to say through Grace's office." It wasn't cruelty. It was the same boundary my father would have wanted me to hold clear, documented and unshakable. 6 months after the gala, Carter & Associates held a smaller, quieter event, not a spectacle, just a gathering of employees, longtime clients, and family, to formally mark my transition into leadership. There was no stage speech about scandal that night. Just a simple toast to my father, to the 50 years he built, and to the next 50 the company would build honestly, transparently, the way he always intended it to run. I asked Tom Reyes to step into a newly created compliance advisory role, a small but meaningful way of formalizing the instinct that had first cracked the case open. He laughed when I offered it, saying he'd only asked one question in one meeting. "One honest question is sometimes all it takes," I told him, and I meant it completely. Marjorie stayed on as my assistant, the same steady presence she'd been for my father for 18 years. Some mornings, she'll mention a small habit of his I'd forgotten. How he always took his coffee black except on Fridays. How he reviewed contracts twice before ever signing them. Those small memories, offered quietly across her desk, have become some of the most healing parts of these past months. Priya Anand's forensic report, alongside the broader case, was later cited in a regional legal seminar on estate fraud detection, an outcome she mentioned to me almost shyly, as though embarrassed to bring good news into what had been, For our family, an undeniably painful process. I told her honestly that turning something painful into something that might protect other families felt like exactly the kind of ending my father would have. Wanted from all of this, Grace Whitfield and I still meet periodically as the remaining civil matters against Vanessa work their way through the courts. She reminds me gently every time we speak that closure in cases like this rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in pieces, a settlement here, a resignation there, a quiet acknowledgement months later that the truth simply held. I've learned to accept that kind of slow, steady justice. Instead of waiting for a single dramatic ending, Vanessa eventually settled the civil case rather than face trial, repaying a significant portion of the misappropriated funds under a structured agreement, though the forgery investigation continued separately through the state. Richard's disbarment proceedings concluded quietly. His name removed from every filing cabinet and letterhead he'd once trusted would protect him. Whatever remained between them afterward, if anything, was never something either of us needed to know. Aunt Carol has become a much bigger part of my life since that night, stopping by most Sundays now with stories about my father I'd never heard before. His stubbornness as a young man, the risks he took building the company from nothing, the way he used to talk about wanting his children to inherit not just a business, but a standard. I understand that standard now in a way I never fully did while he was alive. Daniel decided, in the end, to defer college for one more semester and take an entry-level position at the company instead, wanting to understand the business from the ground up rather than inherit an executive title he hadn't earned. I didn't push him either way. Watching him choose that path on his own, quietly and deliberately, felt like one of the clearest signs yet that our father's values had survived everything Vanessa tried to bury. I still design buildings on the side when I can find the time. But most of my days now are spent walking the halls my father once walked, greeting employees who remember him fondly, making sure every decision I make honors the standard he set. Some nights I sit in his office long after everyone's gone home, and I say thank you quietly to a man who taught me exactly how to fight, patiently, honestly, and without ever losing myself in the process. I kept his old office exactly as it was. The framed photo of the two of us at the opening of his first building, still sitting on the desk next to the practical watch he once gave me on my 30th birthday. The one Vanessa had briefly worn to a meeting that now feels like it happened in another lifetime entirely. I think about him most mornings before the office fills with people. Not with anger anymore. Just gratitude that the truth, eventually, always finds a way to matter. There's a framed quote on the wall near the reception desk now. Something my father used to say often enough that Marjorie had it engraved without telling me, as a surprise the week I took over the office fully. A name only means something if you protect it. Employees pass it every morning. I like to think it does more good sitting there in plain sight than it ever could locked away in a private study. People ask me sometimes if I regret waiting so long to confront Vanessa. If the silence, the patience, the months of quiet evidence gathering cost me something I can't get back, I tell them the truth. It cost me nothing my father would have wanted spared. He taught me that a name only means something if you protect it properly, with proof, with integrity, and with the courage to wait for the right moment. I did exactly that. People ask me sometimes if I regret waiting so long to confront Vanessa. If the silence, the patience, the months of quiet evidence gathering cost me something I can't get back, I tell them the truth. It cost me nothing my father would have wanted spared. He taught me that a name only means something if you protect it properly, with proof, with integrity, and with the courage to wait for the right moment. I did exactly that. Tom still teases me occasionally about being the reason the whole thing unraveled, though we both know it took every single person who chose honesty along the way. Marjorie's logs, Priya's report, Daniel's courage, Aunt Carol's memory, Grace's patience, and Tom's one uncomfortable question in a meeting nobody else wanted to ask. My father used to say, a company is only as strong as the people willing to tell the truth inside it. I finally understand exactly what he meant some nights. When the office is empty and quiet, I think about the gala. Not the reveal itself, but the moment just before it, standing at the podium, folder in hand, looking out at a room full of people who still believed in my father's name. I remember thinking clearly and calmly that whatever happened next, I wasn't doing it for anger. I was doing it because he deserved the truth, even after death, and so did everyone who trusted the name on that building. I've come to understand grief differently since all of this. For a long time, I thought grief was simply the absence of someone. Now I understand it can also be a kind of responsibility, a chance to carry forward exactly what someone stood for, even when the people closest to them try to bury it. My father's legacy isn't the buildings his company constructed. It's the standard he held quietly, consistently, for 50 years. I intend to hold it just as long. Daniel and I still talk about our mother, his mother, occasionally, carefully, without pretending the situation is simple. He visits her sometimes, alone, and doesn't tell me much about those visits. And I don't ask. I trust him to navigate that relationship in whatever way lets him keep his own integrity intact. It's not my forgiveness to offer or withhold. It's his relationship to define on his own terms, in his own time. The company's next anniversary gala is already being planned, a full year out, and this time there's no hidden folder in my bag. No evidence to reveal, no reckoning waiting behind a podium. Just a straightforward celebration of the people who've kept this place running honestly, year after year, long before I ever needed to prove anything to anyone in that room. Sometimes Marjorie catches me staring a little too long at my father's photo on the desk, and she'll quietly set a cup of coffee down beside me without a word, the same way she used to for him. Small kindnesses like that have carried me through more of this than any courtroom victory ever could. I've learned that justice matters, but it's the people who stayed honest along the way who actually rebuild what's broken. I don't know if Vanessa will ever fully understand what she lost that night, beyond the company, the title, the money. I don't think about her often anymore, honestly. Most days my mind is on quarterly reports, on Daniel's progress learning the business, on Marjorie's quiet steadiness, on the standard my father set that I intend to keep protecting for as long as this company carries his name. This is the last chunk of the story, and I want to leave you with the one thing I've come to believe most deeply through all of it. The truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs a place and a moment to finally be heard. Mine came on a stage in front of 300 people with a folder full of proof. And it was enough. It was always going to be enough. If Emily's story moved you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. New family drama stories drop every day, and you won't want to miss the next one. Drop a comment below. Would you have waited as long as she did, or exposed the truth sooner? Thanks for watching till the very end.